The tea room at Mrs. Lovel's tea and trinket shop had a charm that made it a haven for the village's quiet afternoons. A warm, rose-coloured glow seeped through the lace curtains, illuminating delicate china teacups and the floral-patterned wallpaper that made the space feel like something out of a bygone era. It was on such a peaceful afternoon that the locals were shaken from their usual routine by an event that seemed utterly out of place. Dorothy Fenimore, a reclusive widow with an air of quiet dignity, had been found slumped over her table in the corner of the tea room, lifeless. A spilled cup of tea sat before her, its contents staining the white linen tablecloth. At first glance it seemed to be a simple case, perhaps a woman struck by some sudden ailment, a tragic yet not altogether uncommon event. But upon closer inspection, something was terribly amiss. There were no signs of illness, no telltale signs of a struggle. And perhaps most unnerving of all, no one had seen anything happen. The villagers had been in the shop when it occurred. Mrs. Lovel herself, the shop's owner, had been busy behind the counter, attending to a group of young ladies who had come in for their afternoon tea. The others, Miss Hargreaves, the librarian, Mr. Tilley, the butcher, and old Mrs. Clancy, were all seated in various corners of the room, quietly sipping their beverages. No one had seen Dorothy fall. No one had heard a thing. The police had arrived shortly thereafter, but they were equally baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no marks on Dorothy's body. The only clue, the one that stood out like a beacon, was the unusual arrangement of items on the table before her. The teacup, though it had spilled, seemed oddly positioned, as if it had been carefully placed there. A small silver spoon rested beside it, oddly turned with its bowl facing up. And there, next to the spoon, was a single strand of lavender, its faint scent still clinging to the air. The lavender was peculiar for two reasons. First, it was out of season, and second, it didn't belong to anyone present. No one in the room had brought it, and no one could recall the smell from any of the shop's offerings. The constables were perplexed. There was no sign of poisoning, no sign of violence. They took witness statements from everyone present, but no one could shed light on anything that might have seemed out of place. Mrs. Lovel swore she'd never seen a thing, her eyes wide with confusion. Miss Hargreaves, a rather nervous woman, claimed she had been lost in a book and hadn't noticed anything. Mr. Tilley, the butcher, had been staring at the window, and old Mrs. Clancy, who might have been asleep, or perhaps simply hard of hearing, couldn't offer any insight either. The case seemed open and shut. And yet, as the evening set in and the constables made their way home, there was one person in the village who was not so easily convinced: Miss Marple. The elderly woman had, for years, been a trusted friend and confidant to many in the village. Her sharp mind, masked behind an exterior of gentle demeanour and unassuming nature, had solved more than a few mysteries in her time. When she arrived at the tea room the following morning, the place was as quiet as ever, and Mrs. Lovel was tending to her floral arrangements by the window. The constables had left their preliminary investigation, but Miss Marple could already sense there was more to the case than met the eye. She made a careful examination of the scene. Dorothy's body had been removed, but the table remained untouched. The peculiar arrangement was still there: teacup, spoon, lavender. Miss Marple, with her gentle but discerning eye, took note of the details the constables had missed. The spoon's position struck her first. It wasn't just the bowl facing up. It was tilted at an odd angle, as if it had been placed with intention. The lavender, too, was a curious anomaly. A quick glance at the shop's offerings revealed no such herb among Mrs. Lovel's collection, and yet its fragrance was unmistakable, faint but present. Not random, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her eyes scanning the room. "Good morning, Miss Marple." Mrs. Lovel greeted her with a smile, though her voice wavered slightly. "Good morning, Mrs. Lovel," Miss Marple replied, her gaze never leaving the table. "I was hoping you might help me understand something about yesterday." Mrs. Lovel blinked but nodded. "Of course, my dear. Anything you need." Miss Marple studied her for a moment before speaking. "I noticed the arrangement on the table yesterday, the teacup and the spoon. It doesn't strike me as something accidental." Mrs. Lovel stiffened, a slight flush colouring her cheeks. "Oh, well, I'm not sure what you mean. It's just how things were left." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice soft yet deliberate. "But you see, I find it interesting that the spoon, despite its apparent simplicity, was positioned so deliberately. And the lavender—" "Lavender?" Mrs. Lovel's eyes widened slightly. "I don't use lavender here." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought as much. It's not one of your offerings, but someone brought it into the room, or perhaps someone left it. It's peculiar, isn't it?" Mrs. Lovel took a step back, her hands fumbling with the edge of a teapot. I really don't know anything about it." Miss Marple studied the woman for a moment, her mind already racing through possibilities. Dorothy had been a quiet woman, reserved, not someone who attracted attention. Yet the unusual clue, the lavender, suggested someone had been sending a message, or perhaps had left something behind in haste. She was sure of it now. This wasn't an ordinary death. As she lingered in the room, thinking back to the other villagers' accounts, a sudden realization struck her. She needed to speak to them again. Something wasn't right, and the pieces were scattered all around her. The crime, though baffling, was solvable, if only she could put the right pieces in place. And so the investigation began anew. This time, Miss Marple would leave no stone unturned. The sun had risen higher by the time Miss Marple had left Mrs. Lovel's tea room, her mind alive with thoughts. The village was unusually quiet that morning, the heavy atmosphere still thick with the mystery of Dorothy Fenimore's sudden death. Miss Marple's eyes darted across the familiar streets, her gaze catching little details: the faint flicker of movement in windows, the breeze stirring the morning fog, the scent of freshly baked bread from the bakery. None of it felt quite right. The peaceful routine of the village had been shattered, and a subtle sense of unease had settled over it like a fog. Her first stop was the village constable, Arthur Marx. A methodical man with a penchant for following procedure, he had made his initial rounds but seemed to have fallen into the trap of treating the case as an unfortunate accident. There was nothing particularly suspicious, after all, in the death of a middle-aged widow who had simply passed away in her tea. And yet Miss Marple knew better. She had seen far too many times how the smallest of details could hide the most telling clues. The constable's office was tucked away behind the post office, small and unassuming. When Miss Marple entered, she found him hunched over a stack of papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Good morning, Constable," she greeted, her tone light, though her gaze was sharp. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, looking up from his papers. "What brings you by today? Have you learned something I've missed?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm afraid not. But I've been thinking, and I do wonder if I might help you narrow down a few things." She leaned forward, her hands clasped. Together, her voice steady and calm, I'm sure you've considered all possibilities, but might I ask if you found anything unusual among the witnesses? Perhaps something out of place? The constable looked a little taken aback. I don't follow, Miss Marple. Everyone seemed fine when I spoke with them. Mrs. Lovel is terribly upset, of course, and the others didn't seem to know much either. Yes, I imagine they didn't, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, but that doesn't mean they didn't notice something. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Perhaps something not immediately obvious. Constable Marx shifted uncomfortably. You think someone in the tea room might know more than they're letting on? Miss Marple smiled, a glimmer of knowing in her eyes. It's not so much about what they know, Arthur, but what they might be trying to hide. She left the constable to his thoughts and went to find the others, starting with Miss Hargreaves, the librarian. The nervous woman had been the last to leave the tea room the day before, and Miss Marple had found her, even in their brief conversation, to be a bundle of twitchy gestures and anxious words. The library was located across from the post office, a charming building with ivy creeping up its stone walls. Inside, the musty scent of old books clung to the air. Miss Hargreaves sat behind the front desk, her spectacles perched on her nose as she glanced nervously at Miss Marple's approach. "Good morning, Miss Hargreaves," Miss Marple said cheerfully, though her eyes observed the librarian's every movement. "Good morning," the librarian replied, her voice tight. I trust you're here to discuss poor Dorothy?" "I was hoping we could chat for a moment," Miss Marple said. "It won't take long, I assure you." She stepped forward, her presence calm yet insistent. "I understand you were reading when Dorothy passed. What book were you reading?" Miss Hargreaves blinked, surprised by the question. "Oh, well, it was a novel by Miss Marple." "Well, not by Miss Marple, of course, but about Miss Marple. A detective story, you see." She adjusted her spectacles nervously. "I didn't notice anything unusual, Miss Marple, really. Nothing that stood out." Miss Marple hummed thoughtfully. "How curious. Did you hear any sound from the corner where Dorothy sat? A cough, perhaps? A movement?" The librarian shifted uncomfortably. "No. Nothing at all." Her voice faltered. "But I wasn't really paying attention." Miss Marple let the silence linger. For a moment, her sharp gaze never leaving the librarian's fidgeting hands. "Of course," she said at last, her tone soft and patient. "It's easy to become absorbed in a good book. Still, something tells me there's more to this story than simply a woman who passed away quietly over tea." Miss Hargreaves' face tightened, and she swallowed visibly. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "We all have our little secrets." She smiled gently before moving toward the door. "Thank you for your time, Miss Hargreaves." As she left the library, Miss Marple felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, an odd hesitance in the librarian's words, a subtle tension in her movements. It wasn't enough to prove anything, but the cracks were starting to show. Next, she paid a visit to Mr. Tilley, the butcher. His shop smelled of raw meat and spices, and the clinking of knives on the cutting board added an unsettling rhythm to the otherwise ordinary afternoon. When Miss Marple entered, Mr. Tilley paused in his work, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, offering a tight-lipped smile. "You're here to ask about Dorothy, I take it?" "Yes, Mr. Tilley," she said, her voice soft. "I'm just trying to piece together what happened that afternoon." The butcher's eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible unease. Nothing much to say, really. I was at the window looking out when it happened. Didn't notice a thing. Interesting, Miss Marple remarked. You were looking out the window, you say? Yes, he nodded quickly. The weather, you know, the sky, looked like it might rain. Of course, Miss Marple said, her voice barely more than a whisper. But it's strange, isn't it? How you, in a room full of people, could miss something so sudden. Tilly's hand faltered, his expression darkening for a moment. I didn't miss anything, Miss Marple. There's nothing more to tell. Of course, she replied softly, her eyes narrowing just slightly. But you know, sometimes people can miss things they don't want to see. The butcher stiffened, his posture growing rigid. I don't know what you're implying. Miss Marple smiled gently, not pressing further, but her mind was already turning. It wasn't the first time someone had reacted with such defensiveness when they had something to hide. The pieces were starting to fit together. Slowly but surely the quiet moments, the inconspicuous details and the slight tremors in people's voices were painting a picture. Someone in that room knew more than they let on. And Miss Marple, with her quiet determination, would find the truth. No matter how deeply buried it was, Miss Marple's next visit took her to the home of old Mrs. Clancy, the elderly woman who, by all accounts, had been dozing in the tea-room when Dorothy Fenimore passed away. Mrs. Clancy, a frail figure with a tangle of white hair and a penchant for knitting endless scarves, lived at the far end of the village, near the churchyard. Her house was small but neat, with the faint aroma of lavender hanging in the air, a curious touch considering the circumstances of Dorothy's death. Miss Marple had noticed the scent again as she approached the cottage, though it wasn't as strong as it had been in the tea-room. When Mrs. Clancy opened the door, her weathered face lit up with recognition. "Oh, Miss Marple, how lovely to see you, dear. Do come in." "Thank you, Mrs. Clancy," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. The warmth of the hearth and the comforting clutter of knickknacks were familiar, even if the smell of lavender now seemed a little too persistent. She made her way to the chair by the fire where Mrs. Clancy had been sitting when the news of Dorothy's death had been discovered. "I trust you've heard the terrible news," Mrs. Clancy said, lowering herself into the chair with a sigh. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room as she took a seat. "I have, Mrs. Clancy, and I'm afraid I need to ask you a few questions. I'm sure you can help me piece together what happened." The old woman frowned, clearly not entirely comfortable. "Of course, dear. Though I can't say I saw much of anything. I'm afraid I was dozing off. You know how it is with my old bones." Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger, her gaze intent and patient. "Yes, but it seems that you were there at the moment it happened. I understand you were sitting in the corner of the tea-room near Dorothy." "That's right," Mrs. Clancy replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But I didn't see anything, Miss Marple. It all happened so suddenly." "How sudden?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but there was a sharpness behind it. "What exactly do you mean by sudden?" Mrs. Clancy hesitated, her hands moving restlessly in her lap. "Well, you know, one moment everything was calm, and the next someone said Dorothy had fallen. I'm not sure. I didn't hear anything myself. But I did notice something when they moved her." "Something unusual?" Miss Marple's voice remained steady, drawing out the woman's words. "Yes, there was something on the table just beside her. A bit of lavender." Mrs. Clancy's eyes widened as if she had just remembered something important. I'm certain of it now. I saw it before anyone touched anything. A single sprig of lavender. Miss Marple's thoughts quickened at the mention of the lavender. It was the second time she'd heard the same detail. First from Mrs. Lovel, now from Mrs. Clancy. She nodded, her expression neutral. It's curious. Isn't it? Lavender in the middle of winter. Do you know where it might have come from? Mrs. Clancy swallowed. No, dear. It wasn't from any of the flowers in the shop, and I don't know anyone who'd bring such a thing. It's a rare flower for this time of year. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Clancy. I see. Thank you for your help. Mrs. Clancy, I may need to return later, but for now I appreciate your time. The elderly woman nodded, clearly relieved to be rid of the unsettling conversation. As Miss Marple stepped out of the cottage and into the crisp afternoon air, she felt the weight of the lavender scent still clinging to her senses. Something about it was nagging at her, something more than the oddness of its presence. She was starting to wonder if it was less of a clue and more of a signal, an intentional message hidden in plain sight. She made her way next to the butcher's shop. The tension she had noticed earlier in Mr. Tilley's manner still lingered in her mind. Perhaps it was time to press him a little further. When she entered, Mr. Tilley was chopping meat at the counter, the rhythmic thwack of the cleaver against the cutting board punctuating the otherwise silent room. His face was set in a stern expression, his eyes glancing up when Miss Marple walked in. Miss Marple, he said, his voice tight. Back again, I see. I'm afraid so, Mr. Tilley, Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but firm. You. See, I've been speaking with several of the others who were in the tea room when Dorothy passed. I wanted to hear your thoughts on a few things as well. Like what? He asked, his expression remaining guarded. I told you all I know. I was at the window looking out. Yes, of course, you've said that. Miss Marple folded, her hands. But I'm curious. You mentioned the weather. You seemed quite focused on the sky. Mr. Tilley wiped his hands with a rag and straightened. What's your point, Miss Marple? Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. I've been thinking. About what you said yesterday. You were at the window, yet you didn't hear anything at all. Not a single sound. His eyes flickered, just for a moment. I didn't hear anything, he repeated, a little too quickly. And yet it wasn't so quiet, was it? Miss Marple's tone remained calm, but there was a certain pressure in her. Words, an implication that she was only just beginning to scratch the surface. It wasn't just the sound of the tea room's chatter. There was the sound of the cup falling, of a person slumping over. You didn't hear any of that? Mr. Tilley shifted uncomfortably, then took a deep breath. I was distracted, Miss Marple. You know how it is. A butcher's mind can wander when he's working. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, of course. But in your case, I wonder if perhaps you were trying to avoid something. Or perhaps someone. It's easy enough to do in a room full of people, isn't it? Tilley's face grew darker, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for a knife. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I told you everything I know. There's no need to go dragging up things that don't matter. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mr. Tilley, Miss Marple said gently, her voice smooth but unyielding. You see, the thing about people is that they often think they can hide the truth. But sooner or later, it always comes out. Just like the lavender. At the mention of the flower, Mr. Tilley's face went pale. His jaw clenched. and for a brief moment Miss Marple caught the flash of something, fear perhaps, before he masked it with a forced smile. "I really must be going now," he said abruptly, turning back to his work. "I've got plenty to—" "Shh, of course," Miss Marple said, her tone friendly, but her mind racing. "I may return later, Mr. Tilly. Thank you for your time." As she walked out of the butcher's shop, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle coming together. The contradictions in their stories, the odd reactions, the reluctance to speak, everything was pointing toward something more than just an accidental death. But what? And why? Each of the villagers, from Mrs. Lovel to Mr. Tilly, had presented a slightly different version of events, and the inconsistencies were starting to pile up. There were hidden motives at play, and Miss Marple could feel the truth just beyond her reach. The lavender, the nervous reactions, the missing details, they were all signs of something more. And she was certain now that the key to unlocking the mystery was buried within the very room where Dorothy had met her untimely end. She would return to the tea-room. Of that much she was sure. Miss Marple had spent hours in the village speaking to nearly everyone who had been in the tea-room on that fateful afternoon. The contradictions, the nervous mannerisms, and the evasive answers had all been added to her mental map of the case. It was clear to her now that someone in that room had played a part in Dorothy Fenimore's death. But the question remained, why? What was the true motive behind the act? And who among them had the most to gain from Dorothy's untimely demise? The evening set in. Miss Marple retired to her modest cottage at the edge of the village, her thoughts heavy. Her mind sifted through the interviews, each one revealing a different facet of the people involved. It was time to connect the dots, to make sense of the maze of motives, and to uncover the truth. The most obvious motive at first glance seemed to be money. Dorothy Fenimore had been a widow, and though her life had been quiet and simple, she had inherited a modest fortune upon her husband's death. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her a target. Perhaps one of the others had hoped to claim her wealth. But who? And why would they risk murder for something so small when there were easier ways? Miss Marple thought back to her conversation with Mrs. Lovel. The tea-room owner had seemed genuinely shaken by the death, yet there had been something too practiced in her distress. Could Mrs. Lovel have had a financial stake in Dorothy's death? The tea-room had been in financial trouble lately. Could a steady customer like Dorothy, with her few small but regular purchases, have been a burden to Mrs. Lovel's struggling business? But then Miss Marple recalled something Mrs. Lovel had mentioned in passing. Dorothy had been a regular, yes, but only recently. Before that, she hadn't visited much at all. Could it be that the two women had become more closely entwined, in some way that wasn't yet apparent? Greed was a tempting theory, but Miss Marple didn't believe it fully explained everything. She turned her thoughts to the more subtle emotions, jealousy perhaps, or revenge. The librarian, Miss Hargreaves, had seemed particularly on edge during their conversation, almost too eager to help. But was her willingness to cooperate genuine, or was she trying to cover something up? The nervousness in her voice, the slight tremor in her hands as she spoke, could that have been fear? Fear of being caught in a lie, perhaps? Or was she afraid of someone else? Miss Marple knew that Miss Hargreaves had always been a rather lonely woman, a bookish sort who spent her days among dusty shelves, never quite fitting in with the others. But had that loneliness grown into something darker? Perhaps she had coveted Dorothy's more active life, the way she was adored by the regulars at the tea-room. Could Miss Hargreaves have been driven by jealousy, resentful of Dorothy's companionship and the attention she received? Still, it didn't sit well with Miss Marple. A motive based on jealousy seemed too obvious, too simple. Miss Hargreaves might have resented Dorothy's popularity, but would she have gone so far as to kill for it? It didn't seem to fit her character. Miss Marple's mind moved on to Mr. Tilly, the butcher. The anger that had flashed in his eyes when the lavender had been mentioned hadn't escaped her notice. There had been something unsettling about him. Could he have been involved for a different reason, a deeper, more personal one? The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more certain she became that the butcher's reaction had been more than just nervousness. Mr. Tilly had been in the tea room, looking out the window, his eyes darting nervously when questioned. His alibi seemed to have holes. He had insisted he hadn't heard a thing, but how could that be? The moment Dorothy had collapsed, someone in the room must have reacted. Someone must have seen something. Could Mr. Tilly have known Dorothy in some way beyond just being a customer? The two of them had lived in the same village for years. Was there a connection between them that had yet to surface? A hidden history that Miss Marple hadn't uncovered? His reluctance to talk about the incident made Miss Marple suspicious, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back. But there was one more possibility she hadn't yet considered. Fear. Fear often drove people to do things they wouldn't otherwise have done. And what could make someone more afraid than the fear of their own secrets being revealed? As Missy Marple sat in her cottage sipping her tea, she considered the possibility that whoever was behind Dorothy's death wasn't necessarily motivated by greed, jealousy, or revenge, but by something far more complicated, a desperate desire to protect something hidden. She thought of the lavender. It seemed to be the key, though she still couldn't quite figure out why. Its presence in the tea room, particularly near Dorothy's table, seemed far too deliberate. It wasn't an accident. Someone had placed it there, perhaps to leave a subtle clue, or perhaps to create a false trail. Could it be that Dorothy had known something? Had she stumbled upon a secret that someone had been trying to keep buried? The villagers, Miss Marple knew, had their share of skeletons in the closet, and sometimes a simple, quiet life like Dorothy's could get too close to the truth for comfort. With these thoughts swirling in her mind, Miss Marple began to review the alibis. Mrs. Lovel had been in the kitchen preparing tea when the incident occurred, but she was the only one who couldn't confirm where exactly she had been. Miss Hargreaves had claimed to be reading, though her eyes had flickered nervously when questioned about it. Mr. Tilly, as mentioned, had been staring out the window. All three had been in the room, yet none of them seemed to have truly seen what happened. But then Miss Marple remembered something small, something she had dismissed earlier. Mrs. Lovel had mentioned that Dorothy had been drinking tea when she collapsed, but she hadn't said what kind of tea it was. That detail, seemingly trivial, nagged at Miss Marple. Could the type of tea Dorothy drank have played a role in her death? And if so, who would have known about it? Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting the pieces of the puzzle fit together. It wasn't enough to prove anything yet. But the motives were starting to take shape. Greed, revenge, jealousy, and fear all tangled in a web that no one seemed able to escape. The lavender, the lies, the small contradictions. They were all part of a bigger story, one that would soon reveal itself. She stood up, determination in her step. The time had come to confront the suspects one more time. Only then would the truth finally emerge from the tangled web of motives that had ensnared them all. The following morning, the village was abuzz with news of what seemed like an unexpected breakthrough in the case. A small yet crucial piece of evidence had been uncovered, a letter tucked away in a drawer at Dorothy Fenimore's home, seemingly forgotten in the chaos. It had been addressed to Mrs. Lovel, the tea-room owner, and the contents were damning. The letter revealed that Dorothy had recently discovered something unsettling about the financial state of the tea-room, and she had been preparing to confront Mrs. Lovel about it. The authorities were quick to seize on this discovery, and the weight of the evidence appeared to point directly at Mrs. Lovel. At once, the air in the village seemed to lighten. The mystery, which had once seemed so perplexing, was suddenly clear. The letter alone, with its details of mounting debts and fears of public exposure, seemed like the final nail in the coffin. Mrs. Lovel, who had already been acting suspiciously, now appeared to have a motive to silence Dorothy before she could ruin her business. The authorities, eager for closure, rushed to make their arrest. The local constable was dispatched to bring her in for questioning, and whispers of the resolution spread quickly through the village. However, Miss Marple, who had spent the previous evening retracing her steps and reviewing her notes, could not shake the unease that had settled in her chest. The pieces seemed to fall too neatly into place. She had witnessed these moments before, when everything seemed perfectly arranged, only for a deeper, more insidious truth to reveal itself at the last possible moment. She sat at her kitchen table, carefully rereading the letter. On the surface it seemed convincing, an earnest plea from Dorothy, who clearly believed she had uncovered something that could ruin Mrs. Lovel's business. But Miss Marple wasn't so easily swayed by appearances. There were too many things that didn't fit, too many holes in the story that no one else had noticed. First and foremost, the timing didn't sit right. The letter had been written just days before Dorothy's death, and yet, according to Mrs. Lovel, she had no knowledge of any such confrontation. Was it possible that the tea-room owner had simply been unaware of Dorothy's growing suspicions? Or had she already planned to silence her before the confrontation ever took place? Miss Marple couldn't dismiss the possibility, but something about the situation felt rushed, too convenient. It was almost as if the letter had been planted deliberately to mislead the investigation. The lavender, too, nagged at her thoughts. No one had yet explained its significance, but Miss Marple was certain that it had been carefully placed. And if the motive was truly financial, if the murder had been committed in a moment of desperation over a debt or a business transaction, why had the lavender been involved? Surely it was too odd a detail to be overlooked. The pieces didn't align. Miss Marple's instincts told her that the real killer had not been caught yet, and that the case was far from solved. She had seen this before, how a piece of evidence could be fabricated, how a suspect could be set up in plain view, and how the true culprit, cleverer than the rest, remained hidden in plain sight. She needed to act quickly, without wasting any more time. Miss Marple set out for the police station. Her gut told her the authorities were rushing to conclusions, and in such a small village, it wouldn't take much to drum up a convenient suspect. She arrived just as Mrs. Lovel was being escorted into the building, her hands bound by a pair of rough cuffs, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple, what brings you here?" the constable asked, a look of surprise crossing his face. "I've come to speak with Mrs. Lovel," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but firm. "I believe there has been a mistake. I think you've rushed to judgment." The constable raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "A mistake? We have clear evidence here, Miss Marple. The letter—" "Yes, the letter," Miss Marple interrupted. I've seen it, but I don't think it tells the whole story. You found a piece of evidence that fits your theory, but that doesn't make it the truth." She turned her gaze to Mrs. Lovel, who stood silently in the corner of the room, her head hung low. "Tell me, Mrs. Lovel," Miss Marple continued, her voice softening, "did Dorothy ever mention any plans to confront you?" Mrs. Lovel's lips trembled as she looked up at Miss Marple. No, she didn't. I swear I didn't know she was going to—" She broke off, her voice trailing off in frustration. "You see," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe Dorothy was going to confront you, but not about the tea room, not about money. I think Dorothy was going to tell you something far more dangerous. Something about the past. Something someone didn't want revealed." Mrs. Lovel's eyes widened, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossing her face. "What are you talking about, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the room. "I think Dorothy had discovered something far more dangerous than your debts, something that had to do with someone in this village. Someone who has a much darker reason for wanting her silenced." The constable stepped forward, clearly agitated. "Miss Marple, what are you suggesting? That this has nothing to do with Mrs. Lovel?" "I'm not saying that," Miss Marple replied, "but what I am saying is that the letter, while it certainly looks incriminating, was only part of the plan. It was placed to lead you in the wrong direction. Whoever did this wanted you to think you had found the motive, money, but I'm afraid there's much more to this." The constable shook his head, but Miss Marple could see the doubt beginning to creep into his mind. He hesitated for a moment, then turned to Mrs. Lovel. "We'll have to look into this further, I suppose. You're free to go, for now." Miss Marple gave the woman a kind, reassuring smile as she left the room. Mrs. Lovel was released, her face pale and frightened, but Miss Marple could tell she hadn't yet fully understood what had happened. The real danger, the real killer, was still at large. As Miss Marple stepped out of the police station into the late afternoon sunlight, her mind was racing. The breakthrough had been false, too neatly wrapped up, too easy. The lavender, the letter, the tensions in the village, it all pointed to something much darker, something far more complicated than anyone had realized. She needed to get to the bottom of it. But she had learned something important in her time in the village. The truth had a way of hiding itself, and sometimes it took just the right nudge to bring it to light. The killer, it seemed, was still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And Miss Marple would not rest until she had uncovered the whole twisted story. Miss Marple's mind whirled with possibilities as she retraced the threads of the investigation. She had spent countless hours in the village, speaking with everyone, involved, and yet something continued to gnaw at her, a sense that there was something just beyond reach, an unspoken truth that no one had yet uncovered. The lavender, the letter, and the tension in the village were all pieces of a puzzle, but they weren't enough on their own to explain the full story. She had a gut feeling that the truth was hiding in the past, buried beneath layers of time and forgotten connections. It was a visit to the local archives that finally provided the breakthrough she needed. As Miss Marple pored over old newspaper clippings, she came across a name that made her pause. Alistair Fenimore, Dorothy Fenimore's late husband. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the name mentioned before, but it hadn't seemed relevant at the time. Now, however, it took on a new significance. Alistair Fenimore had been a prominent figure in the village many years ago, a man known for his generosity and his involvement in local charities. His sudden death had been a tragedy, a shock to the community. The official cause had been a heart attack, but there had always been whispers that Miss Marple had dismissed at the time as idle gossip, whispers that now seemed more important than ever. As she sifted through more articles, Miss Marple uncovered a troubling detail. Before his death, Alistair Fenimore had been involved in a heated dispute with several prominent members of the village, including Mrs. Lovel, the tea-room owner. The conflict had centred around a piece of land, an area just outside the village that Alistair had been trying to purchase for years. But Mrs. Lovel, along with a few others, had fought him tooth and nail, citing sentimental reasons for their opposition. The land had been passed down through generations, and none of them were willing to sell. At the time, the dispute had seemed insignificant, just another local squabble. But now, in light of Dorothy's death, it took on a new, darker meaning. Was it possible that the land had played a role in Dorothy's murder? Had her husband's unresolved business dealings somehow come back to haunt her? The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. The connection between Mrs. Lovel and Alistair Fenimore was too significant to ignore. But there was something else, something that had been lurking just beneath the surface. As Miss Marple continued to dig, she uncovered another startling connection. The librarian, Miss Hargreaves, had once worked for the Fenimore family. In fact, she had been employed as a governess to Dorothy's children for several years before the family's financial troubles had forced her to leave. Miss Hargreaves had never mentioned this fact during her interview, and Miss Marple found it strange that such a key detail had been omitted. What had caused Miss Hargreaves to sever ties with the Fenimores? Was there bad blood between them? Could she have harboured resentment toward Dorothy, perhaps because of the family's decline, which had led to her own personal hardships? The connections were becoming clearer. Mrs. Lovel, Miss Hargreaves, and even Mr. Tilley all had histories with the Fenimore family, and all seemed to be tied to the events leading up to Dorothy's death in ways no one had considered before. Miss Marple could feel the shadows of the past pressing in on the present, threatening to reveal a truth that no one was ready to face. She decided it was time to speak with Miss Hargreaves again. The librarian had been an enigma from the start, polite but distant, eager to help but withholding. The fact that she had failed to mention her previous employment with the Fenimore family suggested that there was more to the story than she had let on. Miss Marple knew that if she could get Miss Hargreaves to open up, the final pieces of the puzzle might fall into place. Miss Marple made her way to the library, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the quiet streets. As she entered the small building, she was greeted by the familiar scent of musty books and the sight of shelves stretching to the high ceiling. Miss Hargreaves was behind the counter as usual, her sharp eyes peering over the rims of her glasses. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said, her voice measured and calm. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I'm afraid I have a few more questions," Miss Marple replied, her tone polite but direct. "You see, I've been thinking about your past, about your time with the Fenimore family." Miss Hargreaves stiffened, her fingers tightening around the book she was holding. "I don't see how that's relevant," she said quickly, her voice wavering just slightly. "I believe it is," Miss Marple continued. "You see, I've come to learn that the Fenimores weren't just a family who fell on hard times. There were conflicts, disputes over land, business deals, things that may have been unresolved when Alistair passed away. And now, Dorothy's death. Well, I can't help but wonder if the past has come back to haunt us." Miss Hargreaves blinked, her face paling. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said in a voice that was too high-pitched to be convincing. "I left the Fenimores years ago, and I've had no contact with them since." Miss Marple observed her closely. "But surely, Miss Hargreaves, you can't expect me to believe that you've had no dealings with them at all, especially not after your long years of service. And what about the land that Alistair was so intent on purchasing? Do you know anything about that?" The librarian swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously. I don't know anything about that." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You're lying, Miss Hargreaves. I can see it in your eyes. You know exactly what happened, don't you? The past is never really buried, and it seems that the Fenimore's business is more alive than ever, threatening to drag us all into its tangled web." Miss Hargreaves's face crumpled. She slowly sat down in the nearest chair, her hands trembling. I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want anyone to find out, but yes, I know about the land, and I know what Dorothy was going to do. She wasn't going to confront Mrs. Lovel, she was going to confront me. She had found out something about the Fenimore's past, a secret that no one was supposed to know." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "What secret?" Miss Hargreaves looked up at her, her face pale and resigned. "Alistair Fenimore wasn't the man he appeared to be. He had made promises to people, promises he never intended to keep, and Dorothy knew. She was going to expose everything. The shadows of the past had finally begun to reveal themselves, and Miss Marple knew now that the present was shaped by old, buried secrets, secrets that, once uncovered, would change everything. The truth was out there, tangled in the webs of history. But now, Miss Marple had to decide just how far she was willing to go to unravel it. Miss Marple's mind churned as she absorbed the revelation that Dorothy had been digging into the Fenimore family's past, uncovering secrets no one had wanted to confront. The librarian, Miss Hargreaves, had provided the key. Alistair Fenimore, a man thought to have been above reproach, had been involved in far murkier dealings than anyone had suspected. But the librarian's confession, though revealing, had left one lingering question unanswered. Why had Dorothy been killed before she could reveal this damning information? And why had the murderer gone to such lengths to cover their tracks? Miss Marple was careful not to acknowledge it, but her mind raced. She had touched a nerve. Miss Marple knew that to understand the killer's true motive, she would need to break the carefully constructed facade of deception that surrounded the case. Mrs. Lovel, Miss Hargreaves, and the others had all been hiding something, each one maintaining their version of events, but their stories were filled with cracks. Now it was time for her to exploit those cracks, to turn the tables and test their responses. A plan began to form in her mind. Miss Marple had always been adept at reading people, understanding their motivations, and finding the subtle shifts in behavior that betrayed their true feelings. She would use this to her advantage, playing on the psychological elements of the case rather than relying on traditional methods of investigation. It was time for a psychological trick of her own. The first step was to arrange a meeting with the key suspects. She would need them all in the same place, under a controlled environment, and she knew just the place: Mrs. Lovel's tea room. It had become the heart of the investigation, and it was there, amidst the familiar surroundings, that Miss Marple would set her trap. As she walked into the tea room the following afternoon, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mrs. Lovel stood behind the counter, her hands shaking as she wiped the counter for the third time. Mr. Tilly was seated at his usual table, staring at the empty cup in front of him, his eyes vacant. Miss Hargreaves was pacing near the bookshelf, and even the usually jovial Mrs. Webb seemed unusually quiet. Each one of them had something to hide, but Miss Marple could feel that none of them suspected what she had planned. She sat at a corner table, her back to the wall, and observed them all carefully. It was crucial that they felt at ease, complacent, in their belief that the investigation had already been solved. She needed them to relax, to let down their guard. Once they did, she would make her move. Miss Marple asked for tea, as was customary, and as she sipped, she studied her suspects. Each one seemed wrapped up in their own world, but she knew better. Her eyes flicked from Mrs. Lovel to Miss Hargreaves, to Mr. Tilly and back to Mrs. Webb. The tension between them was palpable, and it was just waiting to explode. She would push them to their limits one by one and see who cracked under pressure. She waited. Then, after a long silence, she placed her teacup down with a soft clink. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the room. "There's something that still doesn't sit right with me. Something about Dorothy's death." At her words, the room seemed to still. All eyes turned toward her, and for a moment, Miss Marple was certain they had all been waiting for the inevitable question. But she didn't give it to them, not yet. "It's strange, isn't it? How quickly the authorities jumped to conclusions. How easily they blamed Mrs. Lovel. After all, the letter, who wouldn't think it pointed to you? But I wonder—" Miss Marple trailed off, looking around the room, letting the silence stretch. Mrs. Lovel's hands trembled again, but she said nothing, her eyes locked on the detective. Miss Hargreaves, her face pale, gave a small nod, as if trying to convince herself that Miss Marple was merely another well-meaning but misguided investigator. Mr. Tilly adjusted his glasses, but his lips were tight, and he seemed to be avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Webb, on the other hand, was focused intently on her knitting, her face impassive, though Miss Marple noticed a slight twitch of her fingers. "Do you know," Miss Marple continued, "what I find most curious about all of this? The fact that no one has thought to look back at the time before Dorothy's death, before all the drama started. It's as though no one wants to remember what happened with Alastair Fenimore." At the mention of Alastair's name, Miss Hargreaves flinched. She hadn't meant to, but Miss Marple had seen it clearly. A subtle crack in her composure, the briefest flicker of emotion. "Isn't it funny?" Miss Marple continued, her voice light and conversational. "How the past can be so easily erased from memory. How people can forget about long-buried resentments. Alastair Fenimore had so many enemies, and yet somehow his death is always explained away as heart failure. Strange, isn't it?" The room grew tense. Miss Hargreaves seemed to stiffen even further, her knuckles white against the edge of her chair. Mrs. Lovel's expression tightened, her eyes flicking from Miss Hargreaves to Miss Marple. Mrs. Webb was still knitting, but her movements had become erratic, as if she was suddenly unsure of what to do with her hands. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened as she studied them all, noting every reaction. The more she spoke, the more she could sense the hidden truths just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. She wasn't merely fishing for answers. She was watching for cracks, for signs of discomfort, for anything that might reveal a lie. And it was Miss Hargreaves, once again, who betrayed the most. The librarian's eyes darted to the door, as if She were about to make a hasty exit, but she stopped herself, catching her breath. Then, in a voice far too calm, she said, "Miss Marple, I don't think we should delve too deeply into the past. It won't change anything. Dorothy is gone, and we have to move forward." "Ah, Miss Hargreaves," Miss Marple thought. There it was, the subtle crack in her composed demeanour. She had reacted too quickly, and her words had betrayed her fear of being caught in a lie. "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm and understanding. "But sometimes, Miss Hargreaves, the past has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it. The truth always finds a way to come to light." It was then that Miss Hargreaves stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. "I'm sorry," she muttered, her face flushed with sudden panic. "I need to go. I have things to take care of." As Miss Hargreaves rushed out of the tea room, her hurried footsteps echoing down the hall, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, satisfied. The crack in Miss Hargreaves' mask had been too obvious to ignore. The librarian had been hiding something she didn't want anyone to know. Now it was time to find out exactly what it was. Miss Marple had already seen enough to know that Miss Hargreaves was key to unraveling the mystery. She would follow her, just as soon as she finished her tea. The game had just begun. Miss Marple finished her tea with deliberation, her mind piecing together the thread she had gathered. Miss Hargreaves's hurried departure only deepened her suspicions. That nervous flicker, the way her eyes had darted to the door when the past had been mentioned, it was enough to warrant further investigation. Still, Miss Marple knew better than to act hastily. The time would come for confrontation, but first, she needed to take stock of what she had learned. She set her teacup down with a soft clink and rose from her chair. As she walked towards the door of the tea room, she caught a glimpse of Mrs. Webb in her peripheral vision. The older woman had stopped knitting and was watching Miss Marple with quiet, intense interest. It wasn't the kind of gaze one would expect from a simple tea-goer. It was the gaze of someone who was carefully watching their every word, their every movement. Miss Marple smiled politely, though her mind was elsewhere. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her something wasn't quite right. Miss Hargreaves had left in a hurry, and Miss Marple was sure she knew where to find her. It wasn't just the strange reaction. It was the fact that Miss Hargreaves had been the last to see Dorothy alive, and she had been hiding something far more significant than the library records or the gossip about Fenimore. She could almost hear the clicking of the pieces falling into place, but as she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, something stopped her in her tracks. The town square, bathed in the soft glow of the early evening light, seemed eerily still. There were no bustling locals, no laughter drifting through the air. No sign of the usual life that filled this part of the village. For a moment, it felt as though the entire town had been emptied of its warmth, its usual hum of activity, leaving only a cold emptiness in its place. Miss Marple instinctively glanced around, feeling the weight of something unspoken in the atmosphere. Her instincts told her to be cautious. Someone knew she was getting too close. It wasn't just Miss Hargreaves she needed to watch. The entire web of deceit seemed to be closing in on her, each thread leading her further into murky waters. Her footsteps were slow, measured, as she moved towards the old, worn bookshop where Miss Hargreaves had spent much of her time. There was no sign of her as Miss Marple approached, but she could sense that something had changed. The shop's familiar windows were dark, but as Miss Marple peered closer, she noticed something odd. The faintest sliver of light coming from behind the curtain, suggesting movement inside. Without hesitation, she pressed her ear against the door. A faint sound reached her, the soft scrape of paper, the muffled shuffle of footsteps, followed by an abrupt pause. She knocked gently, and the sounds inside stopped immediately. "Miss Hargreaves," Miss Marple called softly. "Ah, you there?" The door creaked open slightly, but it was not the librarian who greeted her. It was the shop assistant, a young man named Harry, whose nervous expression did not match the calm demeanor he tried to project. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, stepping into the doorway, blocking her view. "I wasn't expecting anyone. Miss Hargreaves has, stepped out for the moment. Perhaps you could—" "I was hoping to speak to her, Harry," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "It's important." The young man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under her steady gaze. I don't think she'd want to be disturbed. She's rather busy at the moment." Miss Marple didn't buy the excuse. "Perhaps I can wait," she replied, brushing past him with an air of determination. The moment she stepped inside, she immediately noticed the change. The room was different, quieter than usual, and the shelves appeared disorganized. Books were missing from their places, their spines half visible from the gaps in the shelves. "Miss Hargreaves," Miss Marple called again, this time more loudly. Her eyes scanned the room, noting every detail. "Miss Marple, I told you—" Harry began, but he was cut off by a loud crash from the back room. Miss Marple froze. The sound of something being knocked over echoed through the store, and the unmistakable rustle of papers followed. Without waiting, Miss Marple hurried toward the noise, her mind racing. She reached the back room and found the door ajar. The sight that greeted her was nothing short of shocking. There, in the middle of the room, Miss Hargreaves stood with a pile of papers in her hands. But what stopped Miss Marple in her tracks was the sight of the desk, a desk that had been hastily cleared, papers scattered on the floor as though something important had been taken. And then she saw it. The book, Dorothy's last entry in the library's ledger, was lying on the floor, its pages torn, its cover almost completely shredded. The evidence she had been relying on, the one thread that connected Dorothy's death to the deeper mystery, had been destroyed. Miss Hargreaves didn't notice her at first, her back turned to Miss Marple as she frantically shuffled through papers, searching for something. Her face was pale, and there was a wildness in her eyes that had not been there before. "Miss Hargreaves," Miss Marple said softly, stepping into the room. "What have you done?" The librarian froze, her hands pausing mid-air. Slowly she turned to face Miss Marple, her eyes wide with panic. For a moment she didn't speak, but then her voice came out in a whisper, as though she were trying to convince herself more than anyone else. "You don't understand. You don't know what you're asking. This was never supposed to come to light. Dorothy wasn't supposed to find out. No one was supposed to know." Miss Marple's mind spun as she looked at the destroyed evidence. Something far larger was at play, something tied to the past that had been carefully buried and hidden by those who had much to lose. "And now you're trying to cover it all up," Miss Marple said, her voice cool but laced with the sting of accusation. "I had no choice," Miss Hargreaves responded, her voice cracking. She knew too much. She was going to expose everything, the Fenimores, the connections, everything. "You don't understand. If this gets out—" She trailed off, her eyes shifting nervously, the realization that she had been caught settling over her like a dark cloud. Miss Marple watched her closely, but before she could ask another question, there was a sudden sharp sound, A creak from the front door. She looked toward the entrance, her eyes narrowing. Someone else was here, and just like that, the pieces started to fall into place. The game had changed, the stakes had risen, and the walls were closing in. Miss Marple could feel it. The real player had yet to reveal themselves, and they were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The silence in the room deepened, and Miss Marple knew that this moment, this crossroads, was where the final unraveling would begin. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she turned her gaze to the front door. The soft creak that had interrupted the tense silence of the back room echoed again. Her mind, quick as ever, began to race. The culprit, the one pulling all the strings, was still in the shadows, biding their time, and now Miss Hargreaves was on the verge of cracking. The destruction of Dorothy's journal was no accident. It was a calculated move to obstruct the truth. But as the puzzle pieces clicked together, another nagging feeling tugged at Miss Marple's consciousness, like a whisper in the dark. Something wasn't right. She barely had time to process her thoughts when the door swung open. For a moment, Miss Marple thought it was the shop assistant, Harry, returning, perhaps alerted by the noise. But what she saw instead froze her in place. Standing in the doorway, breathless and wild-eyed, was none other than Mrs. Webb, the once genteel and composed matron of the village. Her face was pale, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a frantic energy. Her hands were trembling as she clutched a small parcel tightly to her chest. "Miss Marple," she gasped, barely able to catch her breath. "It's happened. Another murder. It's happened again." Miss Marple's heart clenched as the weight of the words sank in. Mrs. Webb, clearly shaken, had no need to elaborate further. Miss Marple's thoughts immediately snapped back to the case at hand. The intricate web of lies and deceit, the sinister threads she had been pulling on for days. It was no longer a matter of piecing together a single tragedy. Now, there was a second murder to contend with. "Where?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady, despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her. "On the edge of the village," Mrs. Webb replied, her voice trembling. "At the old mill. They found him, just like last time. No clues, no explanation, just like the first one." Miss Marple felt the familiar coldness creep over her, the calm detachment that only came when she was confronted with the raw, unsettling facts of a mystery. She knew immediately that the killer had not only struck again, but had done so with purpose. This second murder was no coincidence. Without another word, Miss Marple turned to Miss Hargreaves, her eyes narrowing as she took in the librarian's frightened expression. "Stay here and don't leave this room," Miss Marple instructed, firmly, her voice laced with authority. "There's much more to this than you realize." Leaving the flustered librarian behind, Miss Marple followed Mrs. Webb out of the tea-room and into the growing darkness of evening. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint buzz of distant conversation. Villagers moved quickly through the streets, their faces shadowed with concern as they whispered about the crime that had once again upended the tranquility of their small town. The journey to the old mill was quick, but every step seemed to stretch on endlessly. By the time they reached the site, a small crowd had gathered around the mill's entrance. A pair of officers stood guard, keeping the curious villagers at bay, but Miss Marple had no intention of waiting in the crowd. She approached one of the officers, her demeanor calm and collected despite the urgency of the situation. "Constable, what have you found?" she asked, her voice smooth, as though she were asking about something as mundane as the weather. Officer glanced at her uneasily before nodding. "Nothing too unusual, ma'am. The body's inside, just like the first one. Strangled. No sign of a struggle. Nothing taken. Just like the other victim. The only thing strange is the way the body was positioned. And there's well, it's best you see it for yourself." Miss Marple nodded, steeling herself as she stepped past the officer and into the mill. The scent of must and decaying wood filled her senses, and for a moment the darkness seemed to close in on her. She moved silently, her footsteps sure and purposeful. As she entered the room where the body lay, her sharp eyes immediately went to the center of the space. The body was sprawled in the exact same position as Dorothy's, an eerie mirror image of the first crime. The victim was an older man, someone who didn't belong to the village, but had been a regular presence in the tea room just days before, Mr. Fenimore. His lifeless eyes stared up at the rafters, his hands loosely curled as though they had reached for something before death overtook him. It was the same, yet it was different. The subtle, sinister touch of the killer was unmistakable. But then, as Miss Marple examined the body more closely, her gaze caught something new, something she hadn't seen before. At the victim's feet lay a small, discarded object, a single, crumpled page from a notebook stained with what appeared to be ink, though it could have been blood. Miss Marple bent to pick it up, her mind already working at the implications. The page wasn't just a random scrap. It was a clue. She smoothed the page carefully, almost reverently, and as her eyes scanned the hastily written words, a realization struck her. The note was a hastily scribbled message, clearly written in a panic. It read, "I know what you did. You can't hide it. It's all over now." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine as the words sank in. The murder wasn't random. It was personal. The killer wasn't just eliminating witnesses, they were sending a message, taunting their prey. But who were they trying to warn, and why? The sudden realization that the case was spiraling further, out of control, hit Miss Marple like a slap. The game had changed once more. What had once seemed like a puzzle, a set of clear pieces waiting to be fit together, now appeared much darker. This wasn't just about discovering the killer, it was about stopping them before they struck again. Turning to the officer standing behind her, Miss Marple's voice was low but urgent. "Seal off the area. No one leaves and no one enters. We've got a bigger problem on our hands." As the officer moved quickly to carry out her orders, Miss Marple's mind raced. The killer was playing a dangerous game, one in which they were always one step ahead. It was clear now. The second victim was just the beginning. The true motive was buried deeper, hidden beneath layers of deception and a past that no one was willing to confront. And Miss Marple, as ever, was the only one who saw the faintest glimmer of the truth in the dark. But how long would it take before the killer realized that Miss Marple was the last threat they had to eliminate? The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. The next move was hers. As the hours passed, Miss Marple stood among the milling officers and the small group of shocked onlookers, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The case had twisted into something far more complicated than she had initially imagined. The second murder, like the first, left behind a cryptic message, one more clue, a riddle wrapped in layers of deception. Yet despite the obvious surface-level connections between the victims, something about it all didn't add up. The puzzle was missing a piece, one that would reveal everything. The town had been on edge, and the search for the murderer intensified. But as Miss Marple stood at the edge of the mill, watching the villagers whisper among themselves, her mind replayed the events of the past few days. It was only in the quiet moments, when she allowed herself to retreat into her own thoughts, that the pieces began to click into place. The hurried movements, the strange comments, the out-of-place interactions, details that had seemed irrelevant at the time suddenly came rushing back to her. Her gaze drifted to the small group of constables still combing through the mill for evidence. The investigation, despite its thoroughness, was missing something fundamental, something that was in plain sight, but too obvious to notice. She had heard the officers discuss every angle, the victims' relationships, possible motives, but they were missing the subtle undercurrent that connected everything together. Then it hit her. It was in the way Mr. Fenimore had been acting when he first arrived in town. At the time, Miss Marple had dismissed his peculiar behavior as eccentricity, a harmless quirk of an out-of-towner. But now, thinking back, his behavior felt orchestrated. It wasn't just his jitteriness that was odd. It was his precise, measured responses, his overly cautious interactions with the villagers. He'd been testing them, sizing them up. She had overheard him in the tea room, speaking with Dorothy a few days before about something trivial. Yet, the words, though seemingly innocent at the time, felt more deliberate now. It was a conversation about books, books that didn't seem like they belonged in a quiet country library. A book on hidden messages, Fenimore had said, his voice tinged with what Miss Marple had thought was innocent curiosity. But now that phrase rang in her mind like a bell. Hidden messages. Fenimore had been an outsider, but he had a connection to the mystery that she hadn't understood. He had known something the others didn't, something important. Miss Marple turned and began to walk back to the tea room, her mind working furiously. The crumpled note left at the second crime scene hadn't just been a taunt. It was a breadcrumb, a message from the killer to someone else. The victim, Mr. Fenimore, had been in the same position as Dorothy, but now Miss Marple understood that the true target wasn't the victim himself. The killer had been trying to send a message, a warning. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Miss Marple's fingers curled tightly around the fabric of the mystery, pulling at the strings until, with a sharp tug, the whole thing unraveled. The killer's motive wasn't just about revenge or greed. It was about something far more sinister, a long-buried truth that connected all the suspects, one they had fought to keep hidden. Back in the tea room, Miss Marple moved quickly, her eyes scanning every detail of the room with renewed purpose. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the constables continued their work, and the villagers gathered to talk in low, hushed tones. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, flipping through the scattered moments that had once seemed insignificant. The misplaced book on hidden messages, the strange behavior of the witnesses, the odd reaction from Mrs. Webb when questioned. It all led back to one person who had slipped under the radar, whose presence had barely been noticed but who had the most to gain. The culprit wasn't someone from the village. It wasn't the librarian. It wasn't even Mrs. Webb, despite her frantic appearance. No. The true mastermind was someone who had woven their way into the very fabric of the town, using its people as pawns in their game. It all pointed to the assistant, Harry. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she put the pieces together, forming a picture clearer than ever before. Harry had always been around, observing, learning, listening. But it wasn't until she recalled the odd way he'd seemed to know things before they happened, the way he'd lingered at the tea room when everyone else had left, that she began to see the truth. He'd been the one to feed the killer information. He had been the link between the victims and the killer, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Harry had known about the old mill. He had known that Fenimore would be there. He had made sure to be seen talking to Fenimore and Dorothy. But most damning of all was the way he had looked at Miss Marple when she had questioned him in the beginning. He hadn't reacted with the guilt or unease that others might have when confronted by a sharp-eyed investigator. Instead, he had watched her with the calculated calm of someone who already knew the outcome. He'd expected her to catch on, but not so soon. As Miss Marple pieced together the final threads of the mystery, she realized that Harry had orchestrated everything, from the manipulation of the victims to the staged clues. He had anticipated every move, and just as the investigation had reached its peak, he had struck, knowing that it would be impossible for anyone to see through his carefully constructed facade. The key to the case had been there all along, right in front of her, an open book waiting to be read. She felt the weight of the truth settle over her, and with it, a sense of resolve. Harry had underestimated her, thinking that his careful planning would outwit even the sharpest of minds. But Miss Marple had seen through the pattern, and now it was time for the killer's game to come to an end. Miss Marple took a steady breath. The next step was hers. The quiet hum of the tea room was almost deafening to Miss Marple as she stepped into the dimly lit space, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room with precision. The scene before her had not changed since the first. Crime, still so deceptively ordinary yet cloaked in layers of secrets. The smell of freshly brewed tea lingered, but Miss Marple could hardly smell it now, her senses sharpened by the quiet thrill of realization. Harry, the assistant, was playing a dangerous game, one that he had clearly thought he had won. But there was something in his eyes when she had seen him last, an unspoken tension that betrayed his earlier calm. He thought she was about to trap him, that the walls were closing in, and yet he hadn't been nervous at all. That was the key, wasn't it? When someone knows the end of the story already, the puzzle pieces no longer seem to matter. They don't fidget, they don't hesitate, they wait, and wait. He had, knowing full well that Miss Marple would come for him. But the question was, why? Why had Harry gone to such lengths? The pieces of the puzzle were in her hands now, and there was a much darker picture emerging. The final step had taken the longest to unfold. His motives. It wasn't just power, not just revenge, and not even the bitterness of a cold heart. No, Harry's motives were twisted in a much more insidious way. Miss Marple had always believed that everyone carried a story, a history that could reveal their deepest desires and fears. She had been right, though it wasn't an easy truth to uncover. Harry had been hiding something more than just ambition or resentment. He had been hiding his own fragile ego, fractured by a life full of rejection and envy. As Miss Marple reflected on his quiet behavior, his occasional slips when he thought no one was listening, a chilling thought settled in her mind. Harry had been obsessed with Dorothy. In the beginning, she had brushed off the oddness of his fixation, dismissing it as part of his shy, awkward demeanor. But as she watched him on the periphery of every gathering, lingering a moment too long when Dorothy was around, the truth became painfully clear. Harry had harbored a secret, obsessive love for the woman he had never been able to claim. It wasn't just the love that had twisted inside him, though. No, there was something more, something deeper buried beneath that. Harry had harbored a silent, seething anger at Dorothy for being untouchable, at Fenimore for having the strength to engage with her, and most of all, at himself for never having the courage to confront his feelings. But it wasn't love that had driven him to murder. It was the slow, gradual erosion of his self-worth, the helplessness he felt in his position, always an outsider, never enough. Harry had spent his life being unnoticed, unappreciated. He had longed for validation, for a sense of importance that always slipped through his fingers. Dorothy, kind but distant, had unknowingly become his fixation. Fenimore, the newcomer with a direct and forceful way of capturing attention, had become a symbol of everything Harry could never be. It was their power over others that had finally pushed him to the breaking point. The first murder had been a message, a way for Harry to exert control over the narrative, to create a space where he could be recognized as someone who mattered. But the more he watched the investigation unfold, the more the walls of his fragile plan began to close in. He had underestimated Miss Marple, and that had proved to be his greatest mistake. But still, something inside him made him bolder with each turn of the investigation. Harry believed that he was smarter than anyone in the room, that his cleverness could outwit all of them, even the detective. But then Miss Marple had come for him, and that was when the second murder had occurred, a final act of desperation. Not a crime of cold calculation, but one of pure, explosive emotion driven by panic. Harry had panicked when he saw the path leading to him narrowing, when he understood that the detective was closing in. But he had made one fatal mistake. In trying to silence the truth, he had exposed the very core of his madness. The second victim had been an accident, someone caught in the crossfire of Harry's spiraling desperation. The truth hung thick in the air now, and Miss Marple could almost hear Harry's breath, shallow and ragged, as he processed the realization that his plans had come undone. She had uncovered the fragile truth behind his actions. Driven not by a desire for wealth or revenge, but by the most basic and terrifying force of all, the crushing weight of his own inadequacies. A man so terrified of being invisible, of being dismissed, had been willing to tear apart the lives of those around him in an attempt to secure his place in the world. As she thought of Harry's cold, calculating moves, Miss Marple felt a flicker of pity. How many others, she wondered, had harbored such dark thoughts but never dared to act on them? How many others had allowed the slow, insidious poison of envy to destroy their lives? The psychology behind the murder had been more subtle, more complex than anyone had imagined. But Miss Marple understood now. Harry wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He wasn't driven by evil or hatred. He had been consumed by the hunger for recognition, by a desperation so deep that it had led him to discard every human connection. With a quiet sigh, Miss Marple gathered her thoughts. The case, though solved, had left its mark on her. The depth of Harry's motives, twisted as they were, had revealed something unsettling about the human heart. The shadows in which people lurked, those places where desires turned toxic, held a danger that often went unnoticed until it was too late. The truth was simple in the end. Harry had killed not because of money or revenge, but because for him being seen, being acknowledged as important, had become the only thing that mattered. And in that desperate, fevered pursuit of visibility, he had taken lives. And now it was time for him to pay the price for what he had done. Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze steady. The conclusion was inevitable. The rain began to fall heavily, the cold droplets pelting the windows of the drawing room as Miss Marple stood, her gaze unwavering on Harry across the room. She could see it in his eyes, the panic, the subtle shift in his posture, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly. He was trying to maintain his composure, but she knew him better than he realized. It was over. He could not escape this time. Harry had always been one to believe that he could outwit anyone, that his meticulous planning and careful movements would keep him one step ahead. But Miss Marple had seen through the facade long ago. She had observed every inconsistency in his story, every hesitation in his demeanor. The cracks had been evident, and now they had grown wide enough to reveal the true picture, one of desperation and fear. "Harry," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice calm, though her words carried the weight of years of experience. "You were never going to win." He stiffened, his gaze flickering, and she could tell that the words had struck him more than he was willing to admit. There was a pause before he responded, his voice low, filled with false bravado. "You think you've figured it all out, don't you, Miss Marple? You think you've solved it, but you've missed something. You've missed the most important part." "Perhaps," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "But I think I've seen enough." His breath quickened, and she noticed his fingers twitching, as if he was trying to keep his hands under control to prevent them from betraying him. It wasn't the act of someone who had confidence in their innocence. No, Harry was cornered. He knew it. She knew it. "You don't understand," Harry continued, his voice becoming more strained. "You don't understand what it's like to be nothing. To always be overlooked, ignored, dismissed. They never saw me. No one ever saw me." He stopped, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. "I had to make them see. I had to be important." Miss Marple listened, her expression unchanging. There was no surprise in his confession, no shock at the clarity of his motives. She had known it all along. This was not a crime born of simple greed or revenge, but of a fractured mind desperate for recognition. "You thought by eliminating those who stood in your way you could finally be seen, Harry," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sympathy. "But in doing so, you only made yourself more invisible. You thought you could escape the shadow of your own inadequacy by creating a tragedy. But all you've done is expose your own need for attention." Harry's face twisted, the anger rising within him bubbling to the surface. "You don't know anything. You don't understand what it's like to be cast aside, to be invisible. I did what I had to do. They never gave me a chance. And then you came, always watching, always digging, always looking for the next clue. I couldn't let you take it all away." His eyes flickered toward the door, as though considering an escape. But Miss Marple had anticipated this. She was always a step ahead. The room was silent for a moment, save for the sound of the rain outside. She could almost hear Harry's mind racing, his internal struggle playing out in real time. He was close to cracking, but she needed to push. "Just a little further. Do you feel better now, Harry?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gently probing. "Now that you've caused all this damage, now that you've taken 2 lives, does the recognition you sought really feel worth it?" Harry's eyes darkened. He looked like he might lash out, his hands clenched into fists. But then, as quickly as the fury rose, it deflated, and he collapsed back into the chair, his shoulders sagging with defeat. "I didn't want to," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice. They wouldn't have ever noticed me. They wouldn't have ever given me what I deserved." Miss Marple took a step forward, her gaze never wavering from him. "You're wrong, Harry. You did have a choice. You could have walked away. You could have taken a different path. But you chose violence because it was the only way you knew how to be seen. There was a long silence. Harry's breathing had steadied, but the defeat in his eyes told a different story. His attempt to control the situation had crumbled. Miss Marple's words had broken him, stripped away the last shreds of his bravado. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said finally, his voice a shadow of its former strength. I just wanted to be seen." Miss Marple nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the tragedy that had unfolded in this small tea-room, of the broken man before her. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only the heavy weight of understanding. "You made a choice, Harry," she said softly, "and now you must face the consequences." The sound of the door creaked open behind them, and Miss Marple didn't need to turn to know that the authorities had arrived, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. Harry didn't move. He didn't even look up as they approached, his body slumped in surrender. The fight had left him entirely. As the officers entered the room and moved toward him, Harry's eyes met Miss Marple's one last time. There was no anger in them now, no defiance, just resignation. She gave him a final, almost imperceptible nod before the officers took him away. The case now closed. Harry's actions, driven by his need to be seen, had caused irreparable damage. And though Miss Marple had solved the mystery, the true cost of his desperation could never be undone. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the world outside the tea-room remained unchanged. But inside, the shadows of the past had been revealed, and the truth had been brought to light. As the door clicked shut behind the officers, Harry was led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, and the drawing-room fell silent once again. Miss Marple stood in the centre of the room, her mind already turning over the events that had unfolded. The case, she thought, was finally over, but then, as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A small, seemingly insignificant detail, something she had missed earlier. The teacup, which had been knocked over during the scuffle in the room, was now sitting perfectly upright again, as if it had been deliberately placed that way. The saucer, which had been on the floor moments ago, was now gently placed beside it, the edge of the cup balanced carefully on its rim. Miss Marple's mind clicked into gear. It wasn't much, just a small detail, but it felt wrong. The piece didn't fit the puzzle anymore. In all her years of solving mysteries, she had come to understand that it was often the smallest of details that revealed the deepest truths. She moved to the cup, her fingers brushing its delicate handle as she inspected it more closely. There was nothing immediately obvious about it, but her intuition told her to take another look. As she turned the cup in her hands, something shifted in her memory, a fleeting image, an offhand comment, something Harry had said earlier. It was enough to make her heart race with sudden clarity. A chill ran down her spine. There was still more to this case than she had realized. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. It had been too simple, too neat. The resolution, the confessions, it all felt too easy. It wasn't just Harry after all. She had missed something, missed someone. Miss Marple's first instinct was to call the authorities back, to have them search the entire house again, but as she reached for the telephone, the door creaked open behind her. She didn't turn. She already knew who it was. "Miss Marple," said the voice behind her, smooth and calm. yet carrying an unmistakable edge of tension. "You're still here?" Turning slowly, Miss Marple faced the figure standing in the doorway. It was not one of the officers, nor was it anyone she had expected. The man before her, unassuming, polished and calm, was none other than Lord Langley, the very man who had hired her for the investigation in the first place. "Lord Langley," Miss Marple said softly, her tone betraying none of the shock she felt at seeing him there. "I didn't expect you back so soon." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm sure you didn't," he replied, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You must be tired. It's been quite a long day." She studied him carefully. There was a slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted the collar of his coat, but it was so subtle that she could easily have missed it. He had always struck her as an impeccable gentleman, well versed in maintaining a calm demeanor. But now she could see something lurking beneath the surface, a crack in the facade. "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "it has been a long day indeed. But I believe there are still some final pieces of the puzzle to fit into place." Lord Langley's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something almost imperceptible. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice betraying the faintest hint of unease. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered from his face. "I believe you already know what I mean." For a moment, Lord Langley said nothing. His gaze dropped to the floor, as if he were searching for the right words. Then, slowly, he looked up at her, his expression hardening. "I had hoped to avoid this, Miss Marple. I thought perhaps I could cover my tracks, but it seems you've been far more perceptive than I anticipated." Her heart skipped a beat. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity, and for a moment she could hardly breathe. She had known that Harry wasn't the only one involved, but now she was certain. The man standing before her, the one who had hired her to uncover the truth, was at the center of it all. Lord Langley had orchestrated the entire thing. "You," Miss Marple whispered. "You were the one pulling the strings all along, weren't you?" Lord Langley sighed, a sound filled with both resignation and amusement. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said, taking a step closer to her. "Harry was never meant to be involved in the first place. I only wanted to ensure that my interests were protected, those of my family, my wealth. But sometimes things get out of hand, don't they?" Miss Marple didn't move, her mind working quickly, as she pieced together the true motive behind it all. It had always been about power, about control. Lord Langley had been manipulating events from the very start, orchestrating everything to ensure his position remained unchallenged. Harry had been nothing more than a pawn in his game, a man driven by his need for recognition, easily swayed by Langley's promises. "I wanted to end it cleanly," Lord Langley continued, his voice now tinged with bitterness. "But you had to show up, didn't you? You had to ruin everything." Miss Marple took a step back, her gaze fixed on him with the unwavering clarity of someone who had seen the full scope of his machinations. "You underestimated me," she said quietly, "and now it's over." Lord Langley made a move, his eyes narrowing. "Is it? You really think it's over?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You may have cracked Harry's facade, Miss Marple, but you haven't seen the full picture. You haven't realized what I've done, how far I've gone. You're too late, Miss—" Marple paused, her mind suddenly struck by the final, chilling realization. The case, it seemed, had never truly been solved. There was still one last piece of the puzzle to uncover, a piece she hadn't yet fully understood, a twist in the final moments that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. Lord Langley's posture had shifted from one of controlled authority to barely contained frustration. He was no longer the calm aristocrat she had first encountered, but a man driven by desperation, as if everything he had carefully crafted was unraveling right before his eyes. Yet even in this moment of revelation, Miss Marple remained as composed as ever, her thoughts moving with precision, as sharp and clear as a freshly honed blade. "You've been careful, Lord Langley," she said softly, watching him closely. "Very careful. But you made a mistake." He stilled at the words, his face a mask of hidden rage. "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice tight with mock disbelief. "What mistake could I possibly have made, Miss Marple? I'm in control here. This is my game." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the teacup again, and she felt the weight of its subtle significance. "The game was never yours to begin with," she said, stepping toward him now. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable strength in it. "You were too focused on controlling everything, too focused on making sure there were no loose ends, but you didn't account for the ones you left behind." Lord Langley sneered, but there was an uncertainty in his gaze now. "What are you talking about?" he spat. "There's nothing left for you to find. I have everything in place." "That's where you're wrong," Miss Marple replied, her voice unwavering. "You see, when Harry's confession seemed too neat, too rehearsed, I knew something was wrong. His story didn't fit with the evidence, but I couldn't put my finger on it until you revealed yourself in the room. You made a small but crucial mistake." The sharpness of her words seemed to make Lord Langley falter. He shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Miss Marple and the others in the room. She could almost see the mental calculations running through his mind, wondering if he should make a move, run for the door, or perhaps play his final card. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "there was a clue in the way you reacted when you came back into the drawing room earlier. You didn't know about the cup." His face tightened, but he didn't speak. His eyes flickered to the teacup on the table, and then back to her. "I knew that when you first arrived. You seemed surprised to find everything in disarray," Miss Marple said slowly. "You hadn't anticipated the small mishap, the overturned cup. But when you returned here to help, you knew exactly where to place it, how to set it up right as if to correct the scene. The thing is, Lord Langley, that wasn't part of your original plan." Langley's lips curled into a faint sneer. "You're grasping at straws, Miss Marple. What does a teacup matter when the real issue is much bigger?" "You're right," Miss Marple replied, her gaze unwavering. "The cup doesn't matter on its own, but it's the smallest things, details others overlook, that tell the true story. You wanted everything to appear perfect, to cover up the cracks. But it's those cracks I've been following all along." Her eyes locked onto him, and she could see the realization dawn in his face. It was almost imperceptible, a fleeting moment of recognition before his expression turned to a grimace. "Do you think you've won?" he asked, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Do you think anyone will believe your story?" Miss Marple stepped closer, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "I don't expect anyone to believe me immediately," she said quietly. "But I have enough for them to start asking the right questions. The evidence you thought was so cleverly hidden is now exposed. The truth is too big to ignore." Langley scoffed. "And what truth is that?" Miss Marple took a deep breath before answering, her voice even but filled with undeniable authority. "The truth is that you didn't just orchestrate Harry's downfall for financial gain or even personal revenge. You wanted to control him, to make him dependent on you, until you didn't need him anymore. But what you didn't plan on was Harry's loyalty to someone else, someone who had been there all along. Lord Langley stared at her, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. "Who are you talking about?" he demanded. "His wife," Miss Marple said simply. "Lydia." The name hung in the air between them like an accusation. Lord Langley's face faltered for a moment, and in that brief instant, Miss Marple knew she had struck at the heart of the matter. He had underestimated Lydia, just as he had underestimated her. "I don't know what you're talking about," Langley muttered, his voice now rising with panic. "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple replied. "You see, Lydia wasn't just a woman trying to escape an unhappy marriage. She wasn't merely a pawn in your game, despite what you believed. She was the one who had the most to lose and the most to gain. She knew everything about your plan, perhaps even before you did." Lord Langley's face drained of colour. "Lydia," he muttered, his voice unsteady now. She betrayed me?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "She had no choice, Lord Langley. She loved Harry, and when she realized what you were really doing, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She was the one who tipped me off. She was the one who made sure Harry's false confession wouldn't hold up. She is the one who finally shattered your perfect little world." For a long, tense moment, there was only silence in the room. The reality of Miss Marple's words sank in. Lord Langley's carefully constructed empire of lies was crumbling, and with it, his grip on everything he had tried to protect. As if sensing the collapse of his defences, he took a step backward, his face contorting with anger and disbelief. "I never wanted this," he snarled. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt, but you and your meddling ways. I should have known better than to trust anyone." Miss Marple stood still, calm and unyielding. "Justice, Lord Langley, is a matter of perspective. What you did wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about control, about ensuring that no one ever crossed you. But you were wrong. Justice doesn't bend to those who seek to dominate others. It catches up with them eventually." Lord Langley glanced around the room, his eyes darting to the door, calculating his next move, but it was too late. The weight of his own guilt had already sealed his fate. "You'll be caught," Miss Marple said softly, as if speaking to a child. "The truth is out, and there's no escaping it now." With that, the officers burst into the room, their movements swift and decisive. They had been waiting just outside, ready to take action the moment the pieces fell into place. Lord Langley was no longer the master of the situation. His fate was now sealed. As they handcuffed him and led him away, Miss Marple lingered for a moment, contemplating the twisted path that had led them all to this moment. It was over. But the feeling of unfinished business remained, a quiet unease in her chest. There were always more layers to uncover, always more truths waiting to be revealed. And as she glanced at the window, watching the first light of dawn break over the horizon, she knew that justice, for all its twists and turns, had been served. But the world would continue to turn, and there would always be another mystery to solve. For now, at least, she had done what she did best. She had seen through the lies and found the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. Miss Marple stood on the threshold of the grand estate, the early morning light catching the edges of her shawl, casting a soft glow on the cold stone of the pathway before her. The case was resolved. Lord Langley would face his fate, and the truth had finally come to light. But there was something that lingered in the air, something elusive that even now she couldn't quite place. She walked slowly toward her carriage, her mind replaying the final moments in the drawing room. Lord Langley had cracked, finally revealing the extent of his lies. But there was still a small, gnawing doubt at the back of Miss Marple's mind. A flicker of something that didn't sit right. The carriage door creaked open, and she stepped inside, the familiar sound of the horses' hooves clattering against the cobblestones filling the silence. The journey back to her quiet cottage would take some time, and for once, Miss Marple welcomed the solitude. But even as she settled into the plush seat, her fingers absently stroking the edge of her gloves, the unease didn't leave her. Her thoughts wandered back to the teacup, that simple object that had been the key to cracking the case. It had been Lord Langley's mistake, yes, but there was something about it that hadn't been fully explained. Why had he bothered to reset it at all? A strange detail, when he could have easily discarded it in the chaos of his plan. And then there was Lydia. Miss Marple had known from the start that she was a key figure in this puzzle, but the way Lydia had remained in the background, so calm, so collected throughout the investigation, left her wondering. Had she truly been working alone, or was there someone else pulling the strings behind her? The thought lingered, just a whisper of doubt, but Miss Marple couldn't dismiss it entirely. The horse's steady rhythm continued as she gazed out the window, watching the scenery blur by. The sky was streaked with the soft pinks and blues of dawn, and for a brief moment the world outside felt almost serene, as if nothing had ever been out of place. But that was the problem. Nothing had ever been as it seemed, and Miss Marple knew better than anyone that even the most perfect of facades could hide a dozen dark secrets. It was then that her gaze shifted, catching sight of something that made her heart skip a beat. There, lying on the seat beside her, was a small, folded piece of paper, its edges slightly crinkled as though it had been tucked there in haste. She hadn't seen it before, and yet there it was, as if it had materialized out of thin air. Her fingers moved without hesitation, unfolding the paper carefully. There were no words, only a cryptic drawing, a series of jagged lines forming an abstract shape with a single letter scrawled at the top, H. Miss Marple's heart tightened in her chest as the meaning of the symbol began to dawn on her. The letter, H, was familiar. Yes, but it didn't fit. Not in the way she thought it should. It was as though this message had been left, for her, a whisper from the shadows. She studied it for a long moment, the rest of the world fading away. It was a puzzle, but not one she had solved yet. Not one that could be easily dismissed. As the carriage rolled forward, she tucked the note back into her bag, the weight of the mystery settling heavily on her mind. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. The quiet countryside around her cottage seemed to calm her thoughts, and Miss Marple found herself pondering the case with the same methodical care she always applied. Yet the feeling that something was unfinished remained. That afternoon, as she sat by the fire, her thoughts returned to the drawing, those jagged lines. They hadn't looked like random scribbles. Not at all. They had meaning. And the letter, H, was too deliberate. She knew that symbol, that shape. It reminded her of something distant, something she had seen long ago but couldn't quite place, and then it came to her. The symbol was not unlike the design on a set of old family heirlooms she had once encountered in another case years ago, a twisted pattern that, at the time, had seemed inconsequential, but was tied to a larger family legacy. The heirlooms had been linked to a well-guarded secret, one buried beneath layers of time and deception. Could it be that the same family was involved here? Could Lord Langley have had ties to that old legacy? Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as the pieces began to fall into place. The H could stand for something more significant than she'd originally thought. It could be a name, a place, an entire network of hidden truths that, at first glance, seemed unrelated to the case at hand. The more she considered it, the clearer it became. It wasn't just about Lord Langley's downfall, nor was it merely about Lydia's escape. There were larger forces at play, deeper connections, buried in the shadows, waiting to surface. Weeks passed and the world continued to turn. The authorities had officially closed the case, and Langley's conviction seemed inevitable. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts rarely strayed from that cryptic symbol, the jagged lines and the looming H. It was as if it were a secret door, waiting to be opened, beckoning her toward a new mystery, one she hadn't even begun to unravel. A letter arrived one afternoon. A thick envelope stamped with a wax seal she hadn't seen in years. She recognized it immediately. It was from an old acquaintance, a fellow investigator whom she had worked with on a case long ago. He was as sharp as she was, and if he was reaching out, it could only mean one thing. She opened the envelope and read the message, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat as the words hit her. Miss Marple, I believe you've stumbled upon something much larger than you realize. You must return to London at once. The game is far from over. The real mystery has just begun. There are those who will stop at nothing to keep it buried. I trust you will know what to do. Her mind raced as the implications settled in. There were threads here, ones she hadn't yet pulled, that could lead her into even darker corners than she had ever imagined. The mystery never ended. It was simply waiting for its next chapter to be written, and Miss Marple knew, with unshakable certainty, that she would be there to write it. As the sun set, casting long shadows over her quiet cottage, she stood, resolute, ready to face whatever came next. The answers would come, as they always did. But for now she would prepare, because the hunt for truth was never truly finished. The game, as always, was just beginning.